Thank you very much. I think it's now time to have Professor Nicola Persico on the floor. And maybe in the final discussion we can have a few more remarks about this. Professor Persico.
Okay. Thank you very much for having me here. It's a pleasure and an honor. I'm going to talk today about the pro-social behavior by business from a strategic perspective. So, whereas the previous speaker has spoken very ably about the societal perspective, I'm going to ask, since these moderations of these bad incentives have to happen at the firm level often, how does this happen and what does this mean for a corporation? So it's going to be much more of a micro perspective, and I'm going to leave any considerations of the social perspective towards the end. So the first slide is called Business and Sustainability, and so starting with the Industrial Revolution, business processes have grown in scale so much that they now impact global sustainability. So for example, fuel emissions that make our planet warmer. You have freshwater appropriations by farmers in the United States makes the Colorado River run dry so that the Mexicans don't get any water anymore. But the people in California can grow rice, et cetera, et cetera. So the social good requires that firms reduce these externalities. The question is, that I want to discuss today is how does this regulation happen in practice? And so I'm going to have a taxonomy of regulation from the point of view of the corporation. So I want to say that there are essentially two ways of regulating. The old way, which is laws and regulations that are mandatory and that are enforced by the government. And then there is a new way, which we start to see increasingly, which takes the name of corporate social responsibility. And it's a different way of achieving social goals, one where there's no enforcement, at least the cooperation is voluntary, sometimes in response to activism, and then it's motivated or enforced by the loss of market share. And both are increasingly important. If you talk to business, you will hear most business people at least claim, I think sincerely, that regulation is growing fast. Why is regulation growing? There are many reasons why it's growing. One is, like we said, that the business processes have become bigger and bigger, more powerful, and so they need regulation more. The second reason is that we can regulate better now because we can measure more stuff. So now we can measure exhaust emissions in cars, and so that's why periodically we get cars checked for emissions, which we couldn't do before. But we can also measure financial accounting within companies, and so we can issue financial regulations that we couldn't before, and so on and so on. This second factor also contributes to the growth of regulation. And finally, a third factor that has to do with this new kind of regulation, this corporate social responsibility, is partly generated by some technological factors that make activism, social activism, more easier and more effective. So these are the reasons why we see, and I think we will continue to see, an increase in regulation. And in this talk, I will take the business perspective. That is, what does this increase in regulation mean for business? And are there strategic implications that smart businesses should be aware of. Later, only at the end, will I talk about the implications from a social perspective. So I'm going to follow my division into two, and I'm going to start with talking about public regulation and business strategy. And I'm going to start with an example that is drawn from the United States. I am sure that there are many similar examples in Europe as well. I want to talk about fuel economy regulation. In the United States, fuel economy regulation dates back to 1975 and to the Arab oil embargo, where Arab countries stopped ships from approaching the United States and therefore blocked the supply of oil for a period of time. This made the United States very concerned with energy security, as they say, and therefore it started to make the regulator and legislators pay attention to fuel economy. As I said before, then there is an issue of measurement, and in that case what could be measured was miles per gallon. And so as a result, the US legislators introduced the corporate average fuel economy standard, which is shortened by CAFE standard. And this is a mandated minimum miles per gallon. So they put these things in place, and the interesting observation is that these regulations are still in place today and becoming more strict now, many, many decades after the initial impetus for the regulation is gone. So that's an example of how regulations accumulate. They are persistent and they accumulate. The same happens in a number of other domains as well. What I want to talk about especially today is use this example to think about what does it mean for strategy for an industry. And undoubtedly, the CAFE standards are good for the environment, but I want to take the perspective of the car industry. For the car industry, if this regulation is binding, then it is potentially very costly. As a result, it should not be a surprise that fuel economy regulation becomes a major strategic concern for the auto industry in the US. A comparable example, one among many, is health regulations for the tobacco industry. Both these types of regulations are really makers of breakers for an industry. And so it is at this point that regulation becomes it stops being something that you have to comply with, and it becomes something that you have to actively manage in a strategic way, in the same way that you think about business strategy. And that's the message that I want this talk to be about. It's not only about complying with regulation, but it's about managing regulation. And so we come to the strategic response by the industry. The auto companies fight the CAFE standards. How did they do it in that particular case? There is a sort of a playbook that industries follow. It's different in different circumstances, but there are certain elements that are common. Things that help the industry fight the CAFE regulation in this case, or limit it, let's say, is firstly that the details of the regulation quickly become arcane, difficult, and complicated. There is dual fleet regulations. Not the entire set of cars that are produced by a company are regulated by the same regulation. Cars that are deemed to be produced not locally, not in the US, are treated differently by the standard. In addition, there are separate limits for light trucks, which are the SUVs, or SUVs, as we say in Italian, I think. There's ethanol fuel credits that mean that you can you can relax the limit if the car is able to accept ethanol enriched fuel for in its tank, and so on and so on. So the point that I'm trying to make is that most people cannot follow the details, and when they don't follow, they get bored and they tune off. So, and that is sometimes helpful in dealing with regulators. Another is that lots of interests that can be organized, and I'm thinking specifically of unions here, are actually on the same side of the fight with the auto industry on this one. And unions in the United States are politically powerful. And in this case, then, there is the strategic response tends to be an industry-wide effort. So what I mean by that is that different companies that normally compete on the product market actually, in this particular fight, they cooperate. What is the result of this set of circumstances? As you can see, I'm now starting to look at this particular regulatory problem much as I would look at a strategic problem on the product market. I look at a set of circumstances in the market that make it more or less likely that regulation will be enforceable or will be effective. So how did the industry do in this particular case? Let's look at a graph of the miles per gallon threshold that the standards require. Here it is. As you can see, after an initial growth in 1975, they've been flat for over 30 years. So that is I think, at least I read this graph as a measure of the success of the auto industry in forestalling stronger regulation. Also, you see that light trucks, the SUVs, have lower standards. And you know, from a social viewpoint, there's no reason why you should treat SUVs any differently than cars. They pollute just the same. But still, they have a lower standard. And this becomes significant when you realize that from 1980 to today, the fraction of cars that are SUVs has grown from very little to about 40% or more, which means that, in fact, fuel economy for the entire industry has worsened, probably. I want to return now to the strategic aspect of the problem of dealing with regulation and give you another little piece that will make us think and illustrate the problem or the issue here. In the 2002 round of CAFE regulation, which is every once in a while, Congress decides that they want to try and improve and increase the CAFE standard. They get together and they try to pass a law or to write a law. And that's when industry becomes especially active. In 2002, unusually, Honda started cooperating with the government and started privately providing information to US legislators that were helpful in trying to raise the standard. So in other words, in 2002, Honda was trying to tighten fuel economy regulations. Why? The answer is because Honda had very fuel-effective cars. And so Honda was trying to, in fact, do something that would damage its competitors more than it would damage itself. In the end, Honda stopped cooperating with the US government and it turns out that in 2002 there was no CAFE standard increase, as you could see from the flat graph that I showed before. But the point of this little story is to illustrate how there is something called like a regulatory strategy, at least for a large corporation like Honda and the other car companies. They think about this regulatory strategy in a way that is integrated with their market strategy. In other words, Honda has cars that are more fuel effective, then Honda is going to try to use regulation to its own advantage. So the takeaway from this is that large businesses can influence regulation. And then there's a second takeaway now. It's not only large business. Small business is also forced to deal with increasing regulation. For example, a high-tech pharmaceutical company may need regulatory approval for reimbursement of a new drug that they're putting on the market. Or a small bank needs to cope with increasingly onerous financial regulations. Or small recycling companies are held responsible for large environmental cleanups. All these three stories are really actually real examples. So they happen in reality. So it's not only large business that is confronted with regulation, it's also small business that is faced with make or break regulation. Regulation that can really has the impact of a strategic size. The question is, can small business do anything about it? And I contend that yes, they also can do, and apparently they do. Here I have a World Bank survey that asks firms of size, I think above 100, which means many small firms are in there, whether they feel that they can influence regulation. And as you can see from the graph that I report here, can you see the bottom? Most firms, firms on the left, a few firms are never influential. These are the most on the left. The highest number of firms, the mode here, is seldom influential. But look at the aggregate weight of all the firms that say they're influential, frequently influential, or very influential. That almost reaches half of the respondents. So I read this graph as indicating a surprising, I think, consciousness or response or sense that firms on average, not only very large firms like Honda, but firms on average feel that they have a measure of influence over regulation. So the takeaway here is that business is increasingly forced to compete in the regulatory arena because regulation is becoming ever more powerful, ever more important. And furthermore, that once they start playing, they play hard. The regulatory arena becomes just as competitive as the market arena. And so firms need and do get a strategic approach to regulation which needs to be integrated with other pieces of a company's market strategy. And the Honda examples was designed to illustrate that. So with that, I want now to move to the second part of my classification, the second element in my classification, which is corporate social responsibility. And I want to claim that there are strategic considerations there too. And I wanted just to give you a sense about the way that I see those. What is corporate social responsibility? Corporate social responsibility is the voluntary pro-social activity that goes beyond compliance with regulation. So why would a for-profit company want to go beyond what it's forced to do and do any meaningful corporate social responsibility? That's an open question that I think many companies are struggling with today. And a different way of asking the same question is, is corporate social responsibility simply a fad, something that will disappear soon? My answer is that corporate social responsibility is not a fad. And why? It's because of the rise of what I call, and my colleagues at Kellogg call, private politics. So let me try to explain what I mean by private politics. I want to distinguish public politics as the politics that I know, that we know here in Italy, that we're so fond of course, in Italy. And that is regulation that is achieved through laws and the political process. But then I want to introduce a new term, which is private politics, which is regulation that is achieved through market actions or threats. And here I have activism in mind, of course. So I have two pictures here. The first picture is for public or traditional politics, where I want you to focus in this picture on the dark blue oval, which is government. Government is the center of this picture, is the place where all the arrows point to. And this is because all these arrows are efforts by people, by interest groups, by firms themselves to influence the regulation that government is imposing on corporations and on markets. In this picture, the picture of public politics, government is king, and everybody wants to influence the king. But what happens when the king is not as powerful as we think? What happens when the power of government to regulate becomes less, less easy to control? Why would government regulation become less easy to control, less easy to influence, less responsive to citizens? There are several reasons. One is partly that national governments are giving up some regulatory authority to supranational governments or to trade treaties. So, for example, this is a kind of a funny example. In Italy, there was a law on the books for a long time that you could not call pasta something that was not made of non-durum wheat, grano duro. If it's not grano duro, then it's not pasta. And there were German pasta producers who were not using durum wheat, but who also were producing pasta, or at least what they felt was pasta, but the Italian government felt was not. And so the European Union compelled the Italian government to change its regulation to allow these German manufacturers to use the name pasta for their non-durum wheat pasta. Now this is of course a funny story, but it indicates how the Italian government lost its power to regulate, in this case, on the question of foods, food regulation we would call it. Maybe the Italians would call it food safety. But so that's one reason why governments simply are ceding some power, some regulatory power to other entities. Another reason why it's difficult for the common citizen to influence regulation is that regulation is partly already captured by the industry. And this is the process that we were discussing before. Thirdly, there are some governments that are weak. For example, in many developing countries, governments don't really have the capacity to meaningfully enforce many regulations. And so for all these reasons, the leverage of domestic activists is weakened. Domestic activists, people who care about certain issues, are less and less able to make their voices heard through the government, through the normal political process. And therefore, we get a different picture, a picture of private politics. As you notice, the government is not linked anymore to anything. Rather, the desires of the wishes of the people, what people are trying to achieve, is funneled directly through interest groups to firms and markets. And so this is what we call private politics. How does that influence take place? Naturally, when we're talking about the government, it's easy to understand. The government simply passes a law and then fines you, or perhaps even throws you in jail if you don't comply. But what happens if, what can an interest group do to you if you don't comply with their requests? Here I have a little image video that will show us what happens. The video is in a language that perhaps only the previous speaker can understand, but I think the images are very telling. The video refers to an incident that, in which the Shell company wanted to take an old oil rig in the water, in the sea, and dispose of it by sinking it. Okay? This was very controversial. It's called the Brent Spar, was the name of that rig. And Greenpeace, the environmental activist group, got wind of this decision and created a huge campaign around it. And it was about trying to stop the Brent Spar from being disposed of by sinking. And they wanted it to be, for the rig to be kind of done onshore, to be disposed of onshore. So let's see if I can get the video to go. Okay.
Probeerde het afgedankte olieplatform Brent Spar in zee te dumpen.
Okay, I took off the video because it's a kind of a news report, but it's in, I think, in Dutch. So I'm not able to understand that, and probably most of you either. But the picture, I think, the pictures are telling. These are the Greenpeace activists who are being hoisted on the platform. They're heroes, as you can see. They wear orange, and they're trying to save our seas. So this was all on the news to the point where a boycott of BP gas was started, meaning that individuals would not use BP gas stations to fuel their cars. And this quickly became very costly for BP. In the end, BP agreed to dispose of Brent Spar on land. So this is an example of what interest groups can achieve. And so this is what they call democracy through the marketplace. The argument for democracy through the marketplace is the following, is that activists are now saying, let's play markets. We can achieve regulation. We can change your behavior much more easily through these kinds of actions that I showed you before than by going through the democratic process. So that's why I talk here about private politics. It's a different form of regulation, and is one that is done privately by these private entities, such as Greenpeace or other activists. So the rise of private politics is driven partly by the three factors I talked about: globalization, capture, and weak states, in part by the social media. A lot of these activism is driven by the ability of these groups to use social media to coagulate interests. And then thirdly, there is a value shift in our society. That is that as we become richer, we start as a society to become more interested in values such as less impersonal society, more say on the job, more say in government. These are questions that are asked in the global, in the World Value Survey, which is a sociological survey that is done in in a lot of countries across many years. And so we can trace the trends. And in this survey, you can kind of distinguish two types of people. One type of person that tends to answer, yes, these are important things that I care about. The less impersonal society, more say on the job, ideas count for more than money, and so on and so on. And then there's another type of a group that tends to respond yes to these other questions, which is strong defense force, fight rising prices, fight against crime. All these things are important. And the point is that these people are different. The people with the red arrow is what we call materialists. The people with the blue arrow are people we would call post-materialists. These are all younger people like you that feel more this way. And if you look at across countries, the fraction of post-materialist people is growing over time. As you can see, there's a lot of countries here. The European community in blue has the highest fraction of non-materialists. Russia has the lowest fraction. They're in the pink. But the point of this graph is that all the countries are growing their fraction of non-materialists. And so the value shift that I described using the social value survey presents a strategic opportunity that is to cater to the post-materialist consumer by making social responsibility part of the brand appeal. And this is what many companies are doing. They recognize that their customers want a more socially responsible corporation, and so they cater to that. Examples would be Starbucks, which we all know, or The Body Shop, which most of us know, right? It's the one for soaps and things like that. Right? Both these companies make corporate social responsibility an important part of their product, I think. But here comes the strategic part. This is not for everybody. This choice entails risks. What kind of a risk? Well, remember the video I showed you before. These were activists that were trying to leverage the brand appeal of a company and use it as and threaten to reduce it. Okay? So what are the strategic risks of corporate social responsibility? Is that companies with a high reputation for corporate social responsibility have a lot to lose. And furthermore, activists tend to choose their target companies strategically. They don't choose them for who has the worst corporate social responsibility, because then outing them would not produce much. Rather, they tend to choose companies with high reputational equity, which are especially vulnerable to the attack. And so therefore, the irony of this is that these are often the most pro-social companies. So the point of this is to also suggest that just as in the regular regulatory strategy, here too, when we talk about private politics, there needs to be a strategic analysis of corporate social responsibility and a decision that recognizes that corporate social responsibility is part of a strategy that doesn't have to be the same for everybody and probably is not going to work the same for every company. And that companies have to weigh risks and rewards. So in conclusion, government regulation is on the rise. Private regulation is also on the rise. As a result, businesses are forced to compete in the regulatory arena with the same intensity as they do in the product market. And therefore, it behooves them having an integrated regulatory and market strategy. A strategy that pays a lot of attention to the regulatory aspect, be it governmental or private. Smart companies already have one, and if they don't, they acquire it quickly. Software companies tend to be slow on the uptake on this, but they learn quickly. Google would be an example. And so that's now the last slide. I've talked a lot about how corporations internalize or should internalize regulation and integrate it with strategy. What does that mean for the social perspective? So here I have to be pessimistic, I think maybe not as, as much as the previous speaker, but fairly pessimistic. So here are my perspectives. That first, regulation, as I see it, and as I have tried to describe it for you, is the result of a clash of competing interests, and thus is unlikely to be efficient, because there is no social planner that is likely going to be able to enforce a coherent regulatory system. Furthermore, a further source of inefficiency is that a lot of the regulations we want to impose are for the benefit of future generations. And in a democracy, future generations don't have a vote. So that doesn't help either. Finally, sustainability is sometimes a global problem, meaning supranational or cross-national. And we have no effective supranational government today. So for all these reasons, no, I'm a little bit not optimistic. What solutions? I felt I had to write something for solutions because I had to be a little optimistic, I don't know. And so maybe that the rise of the post-materialist consumer will save us before it's too late. And that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was an excellent presentation. Floor open, questions. Questions?
Okay. Yeah, I have a question. According to a report from the World Economic Forum published a few months ago on impact investing, it seems that 36% of the millennial generations stated that one of the primary purpose of making business is to improve society. So do you think that this, and how do you think that this is going to impact the way of seeing and doing business? Thank you.
Thank you. It's a very interesting question. So for just to summarize, social investing is the idea that investment shouldn't only produce a monetary return, but also the money should be invested in something that's worthwhile for society. So for example, an investment fund shouldn't invest in sin stocks, gambling, online gambling, video porn sites, what have you. You know, all these things are maybe not as desirable as investments, and maybe this extends to a great variety of you know, how should I say, there are different gradations. So for example, universities in the United States are pushed, and usually are, they are pushed into not investing in countries that use child labor, for example. And that's a lot of countries, obviously. So, so responsible investing, impact investing, all of these ideas, they're clearly coming up. There are specialist funds in the private sector that invest, that call themselves impact investing or responsible investing, etc. And so to the extent that people want to have that financial product, they can buy it. They're not humongous, they're not enormously large, they may grow in the future. I think a interesting and difficult question arises when we have entities of a public nature, such as, for example, a pension fund that invests the funds of the pensioners, but the pensioners are not in any meaningful way governing it. Is it legitimate for such a fund to do impact investing? And I think that's a difficult, it's a difficult call to make, because of course we all like to invest in good things, but the question is, are the pensioners, all the pensioners, on board with investments that don't necessarily maximize the return on investment? And I think we're going to increasingly see problems, or difficult problems of this kind.